Planning for Population Growth, a Dynamic Canvas. Welcome, I'm Dr. Mujtaba Moharrer, co-organizer of the Mobility Roundtable based at the Skavens-Eye Research Institute, Mass Eye at Harvard Medical School in Boston. I and my colleague, Dr. Andrew Tomlinson from the University of Leeds in the UK will start the introduction and we will together do the Q&A and the final discussion. It's great to have you all here. I will pass on to Andrew.
Thank you. Yeah, so today's roundtable is around the idea of the city. As we all probably know, urbanization appears to be an unstoppable trend. According to the UN, 54% of the global population live in urban centres, and this is expected to grow to up to 85% by the end of the century. And on the ground, the established cities are growing in size, whilst at the same time, the number of urban centres has doubled over the last 40 years, with more than 500 now having a population of at least 1 million and 29 megacities with over 10 million people. And this number is expected to rise to over 40 by 2030. So cities seem to be cities really do seem to be places where everyone wants to be located, and a growing population puts a strain on a city's resources and its built environment in terms of the provision of sufficient housing, services, and crucially, the transport infrastructure. But this picture of growth isn't entirely consistent, because even just yesterday, a report published by the University of Washington highlighted that global population numbers, particularly in developed economies, are in decline due to falling fertility rates and resulting in an aging population. So cities may soon need to adapt as well to further changing population demographics and perhaps ultimately a falling population. So the aim of this roundtable is to discuss how we can create cities which are suitably livable and at a human scale, and in which citizens are easily mobile, but whilst at the same time being responsive to change in both size and the demographic makeup of the population. And, you know, I've tried to really point out that the city is truly a dynamic canvas, which must continually evolve to respond to these and other changes. So we're very lucky today to have our first speaker, who is Richard Cani, a highly regarded town and transport planner with 25 years experience. He's currently the global planning leader at the design and engineering consultancy Arup, and was previously the managing director for planning at Transport for London for 16 years. He focuses on city scale and corridor level projects, and aims to develop new proposition for transport corridors. So I'll hand over to Richard now to start the roundtable.
Great, thank you, Andrew. I'm just checking I'm not on mute. No, that's good. I'm just going to, hello everyone on the call. I'm just going to share my screen as well. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. I can see some nodding, which is always good. So what I wanted to do was just to talk about a number of things, really. So just touching on the introductory points that Andrew's made about this urbanization that we've seen taking place across the developed and developing world, and starting to think about the immediate impacts those same cities are facing from COVID-19, and whether this is somehow going to lead to a change in that pattern. I mean, I guess the first thing to kind of focus on, let's see if I can get this to present. Okay, good. So the first thing to focus on is that we have seen, you know, huge increase in population in our cities. You know, this is sometimes seen as a phenomena that's affecting fast growing countries like China, or countries in Asia or Africa, but also in very old developed cities as well. So the diagram in box 1 is actually the population graph for London going back to the 1800s. And you can see, like many developed cities, we went through this period after the Second World War in the UK's instance, where population fell. People moved out of cities, they moved to the suburbs, they moved to smaller towns. We had a new town programme in the UK, and the population of London fell for about 25 years. then something started to change. And it was a combination of factors that caused the urban population to start growing again. And that was primarily to do with jobs and economic opportunities. That there was a recognition that there were better jobs, higher paid jobs, more interesting jobs, and a better quality of life overall could now be had in our larger cities. So we've been through a period in London over the last 20 years where we've seen, year on year increase in population, partly fueled by inward migration, both from within the UK, from other regional cities, but also from within Europe, but also people choosing to stay in London, stay and have their families, and to develop a life in London, whereas previously they may have chosen to leave. So one of the positive consequences of that is cities create far more opportunities to deliver more integrated and more sustainable transport. The density, the concentration of trips, those kind of heavy kind of flows of demand, taking people into work, into shopping, whatever they're doing, that concentration of demand in a small area supports the case for high capacity public transport. But also the types of trips that take place in cities can also support more active travel as well. So as a result, we see far more sustainable transport patterns in many of our developed cities. So just moving to box 3, what we've seen across the world as a result of COVID-19 and the various lockdowns that have taken place is a dramatic reduction in travel demand, where people are just staying at home and not travelling. One of the consequences of that in London, for example, has been demand for the tube in London has been at 5% of normal levels for that time of year. So an absolute transformational change. And it still hasn't recovered anywhere near pre-COVID levels, still operating about 15% of pre-COVID demand. What we're seeing is people living local, living and working local, carrying on with their lives. If they can work online, they can work remotely, they're doing so like we are today. They're actually finding it more rewarding. They're finding they can connect, collaborate more easily by talking to people more effectively than if they're in an office, which means they're traveling less and they're traveling locally instead. So does that mean this could be the end of the growth of our large cities? And what does that mean about the kind of transport outcomes that will be delivered as a result? So there's a huge amount of uncertainty. So we don't actually know. So what we do know is the level of reduction in travel demand we've seen as a result of COVID. And this is a graph taken from London. It could be any city in the world that's been affected by the pandemic. That massive reduction in travel demand as people go into lockdown and that recovery, and a huge amount of uncertainty about what that future recovery looks like. When you look at what's happening in China, and they've been coming out of lockdown ahead of most of the world, they're almost back to where they were in terms of level of public transport demand. But you look at other cities and it's much slower, and it's a much more different effect in terms of those long-term changes. And we're starting to see the emergence of some really significant shifts around travel demand, with people staying at home, working from home 2-3 days a week, which will profoundly impact on the demand for transport and the case for public transport in our cities. So what do we know? There's a lot we don't know at the moment, but what do we know? So the first point is there are some fundamental shifts in the drivers of demand for travel, largely as a result of people working from home. So we did some research in London, and prior to COVID-19, when people were asked how many days a week would you like to work from home, the answer was typically somewhere between half a day and 1 day. We did the same survey about 3 weeks ago, and the answer was 2.5 to 3 days a week. So we see some significant shifts in drivers of demand. That's leading to a significant decrease in public transport ridership, leading to some major budget challenges, which is likely to lead to some new models of funding and operation. In London, Transport for London had got to the point where it was self-financing. So it was covering its operating costs from revenue it generated through fares. It's had to go to the government and get a bailout of £4 million to cover those costs, which means the operating model it was working to, that self-financing model, is now broken. So there needs to be a new model of funding public transport in many of our cities. And number 3, when you look at the infrastructure that we've had, this has highlighted how ill-suited some of that infrastructure is and its difficulty of adapting to a change in circumstances. So we have massive investment in fixed rail networks that have largely been empty. We have the road network, which has been transformed as a public space for people walking, cycling and spending time outdoors. And that's having an impact on congestion. So we're seeing multiple demands on our road space. So you take developed cities with smaller roads, where the ability to expand road space is quite limited, you know, we're seeing the reallocation of that space to pedestrians, cyclists, restaurants, pubs, businesses, because outdoor space is now more valuable and more important. That means less space for vehicles, potentially more congestion. But things are happening in different cities in different ways. We have to recognise that cities operate and function in different ways. So to the left of this diagram, we have very public transport focused cities that rely very heavily on high capacity public transport networks with very high levels of public transport usage. So these are very sort of, you know, dense cities with a defined central business district, high densities, mixed land use patterns, highly dependent. So like London, New York, Paris, Shanghai. We then have at the other extreme in the middle, these car dominated, you know, metropolises like Los Angeles or Dubai or potentially Istanbul, which have lower densities. They don't have those concentrations of trips in one place. It's much more dispersed, more spread, and tend to be car dominated. And then to the end, we have those cities that are far more mixed, you know, where we have high density at the city centre, declining towards the suburbs. We have a combination of public transport use, high car dependency in different parts of the city, and transport demand is met by a range of complementary modes. So a couple of examples there: Toronto, Sydney, Birmingham in the UK. So just to sort of start to think about some of the kind of worlds we may be going into. So we've talked about the growth in population in cities and that kind of constant kind of flight to the city, that urbanization trend that we've been living with for decades. Perhaps we're moving to a more polycentric and virtual world where we might have more flexible working, allowing people to work at different times from different locations. And that has a greater focus on local amenities, more people locally active, increasingly engaged with local issues, and a reduction in the role of the city centre. That might mean the death of the commutes and the birth of new travel patterns. So we might never recover to pre-crisis levels, where more kind of active local transport solutions rule the day. In the middle, we might be in a world where public transport demand never recovers and new modes of transport and private modes of transport become the standard. We're already seeing this in many parts of the world, in the United States, for example, where much of the guidance has been about not to use public transport, but to focus on cars instead. So perhaps public transport never recovers. The cities provide the support and the regulation, but for more of a private sector-led transport network. What does that mean for the outcomes we might get from our transport networks? But there could be a scenario where we get back to nearly where we were. Public transport demand recovers, but investment is no longer affordable or justified. So that might lead to a reprioritization or an increase in charges to cover those costs. But also alongside of that, we can't just think about, you know, the crisis in isolation. We have to think about the other priorities that are shaping our cities and our approach to transport: climate change, equity, public health, well-being, access to jobs, social equity. All those things have been heightened through this pandemic. So the role of transport in cities in addressing those challenges will increasingly become important over the coming years. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Richard, for a very interesting summary of the changes brought about by COVID and looking ahead. It clearly is a big problem around how public transport is going to be funded with such significantly reduced demand. We'll probably come back to that in the questions. But the second speaker today is Dr. David Milne, who's a colleague of mine, an academic at the University of Leeds, working both within the Institute for Transport Studies and also the School of Geography. And his interests really align well with the discussion of the roundtable today. His research interests include a focus on the spatial network models of transport systems, geographic understandings of transport planning, and the social geography of modern mobility. So I'm sure we'll have an interesting perspective from Dave now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, fascinating first talk. Let me see how I can succeed in following. So I'm by background a historical geographer, and so I was actually quite excited when I saw the population of London over a long period of time. But I always tend to look at the big picture, and for me, when I look at the big picture on this topic, I think there are sort of three issues really stood out to me. The first is that we're living in an era of really quite high technology and advancing technology. We've reached a level of high technology in transportation, but we're now going through really rapid development in information technology. And I think those things are going to contribute to the fact that migration to cities is probably going to continue. And migration generally around the planet is going to become greater, simply because there are no boundaries anymore. And that's what that IT means. I think as the second point I came to is that, which relates to the first, is that I think we're possibly seeing the first, what I would consider to be truly global generation of younger people coming through. So actually one interesting thing that possibly wasn't mentioned in the first talk that I might add to it is the idea that we have in many countries a bit of a generation gap. There are younger people whose patterns of life and mobility are quite different to some of the older people, and their expectations are different. The third thing on the current pandemic, I've heard quite a lot of people talking about what they think is going to happen in, to travel demand. And I hear a lot of people talking still about the idea of, oh, well, we're going to need more social distancing. We're not going to be able to use public transport so much. And I guess that may be true, but my intuition is that probably we will find a solution to this. History suggests that we will. I don't see social distancing myself as being likely to stay the course. And therefore, I think we probably, from a planning perspective, we need to be thinking, what happens beyond getting a vaccine or a solution to the problem that allows us to live more normal lives. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to go or end up in Richard's third stage scenario where everything goes more or less back to normal. I think there are things will have changed during this period that we'll probably see changing for the longer term. So I guess my thinking on this topic was to think about what the implications are for planning transport in cities. And I think one of the things in the past is that we often haven't really considered the implications of growth and migration that much at all. We've sort of assumed that, the market will cope in many places. So I'm sort of thinking that probably what's required if we want better cities is more proactive planning, and to consider the transport implications of what developments we make up front in the planning process. And I think that can be a real challenge in environments where planning tends to be developer-led. One observation I sort of made in my own academic experience when I was coming through as a student is that when I was an undergrad student, actually doing a master's in urban planning was really quite a popular thing to do. But by the time I graduated, urban planning seemed to be on the way down and transport planning seemed to be on the way up, and so I chose transport planning. And I think what's interesting about that is that urban planning is sort of more what you want, the world you want to create, and transport planning is often the reaction to that world, and how do we stop it causing chaos. And I think part of that, trying to consider the implications up front is if we're developing new areas of cities, so we're talking about cities that are actually expanding, then we need to consider putting in the transport infrastructure first, which is something I see on an annual basis because I take a group of students most years, this year unfortunately not, to Helsinki. And my experience of going to Helsinki is that it's an interesting example of a place where it just so happens the city authority owns a lot of the land, and therefore they can control the planning process quite a lot. And one of the main things they do is they put in the transport infrastructure and then allow the development to grow around it. So I have numbers of photographs of a tram running through a building site, essentially, and it's already there. Everything's on it. There are even one or two people on it. They're probably traveling to the building site for work, but the infrastructure has already been put in before the development takes place. And I guess what I'm thinking, the logic of this, is that I actually think we possibly overplay the role of choice, perhaps because we've been dominated by particular economic perspectives in transport. We tend to think that travel behavior is something that's really hard to control. And therefore we think that it doesn't really matter what we do as planners, people will do what they want to do. I'm not sure that's true. I actually think if you invest in the sorts of transport that you want people to use from maybe from a sustainability perspective, for example, and give them clear signals, the chances are, as long as you've thought it through and it's realistic, they will start to use it. And the reason we've ended up in a situation where so many people travel by car is because we've invested so much in infrastructure for cars. And so in the end, I actually think the problems we've got are probably more political problems and a willingness to actually step up and put in the transport solutions that would lead us to better cities. And it really, to me, it really shouldn't actually be so hard. I think we have the technical understanding there. We've got loads of examples of how and why it's been done badly in the past. We probably have a pretty good understanding of what types of journeys people need to make and what means of transport they're likely to have at their disposal, and what the greatest inefficiencies are from a sustainability perspective. So what can we actually do? Well, I would say possibly what we need to do more of is prioritize managing mobility. Often if you look in literature, professional and academic literature, predict and provide is talked about as a sort of a past way of doing things, but I'm not sure it is, because I think we've sort of realized sometime in the 80s and 90s, we realized, certainly in the UK, that wasn't a good idea, but we've never really replaced it with anything else. And we still tend to think of transport in terms of travel time and saving travel time and economic benefits, and often we don't think of what the societal benefits are. And to come back to the pandemic, one of the things I've found interesting in the pandemic is the fact that if you look at the level of transport activity, it has really dropped tremendously. I mean, Richard gave a figure of, was it 5% on the tube? Yet when you see the economic figures, it seems that the economy has contracted by 20% or 25%. So that starts to make me think that actually all this transport we had going around cities causing chaos and wasting lots of time in people's lives, actually some of that is almost sort of economic froth on the surface, because there's still lots of economic activity there. So maybe we need to actually understand the different types of activity that lead to this extra transport. And in particular, I mean, we mentioned before the idea of the death of the commute. Yes, I think in our economic understandings and economic modelings of transport, we've always tended to treat work trips as the ones that cannot be changed. These are the essential trips. But if you talk to most people who've been in lockdown, are they more interested in when they can get back to the office, or are they more interested in when they can go on holiday and experience a new environment? And I think maybe we have to reassess that balance, because if we can achieve a lot of what we need to achieve without that travel around cities, then actually maybe it's the commuting trips that should be treated as less important for those people whose jobs allow that. And maybe then there needs to be some sort of intervention in that. So yeah, my agenda is that we should probably be treating mobility more as a service. And okay, people will be aware that mobility as a service is a bit of a tagline, and I think it's, again, that's an idea that I first came across in Helsinki. I actually knew the person whose thesis that came out of, and I think it's a really important concept that we need to be focusing on mobility rather than modes, rather than the choices that people have. How can we provide the best mobility? And in different cities, Richard put up these pictures of different cities, and it's clear that it's likely to be the case that the most sustainable travel option for those cities may be different. So whichever is the most sustainable option for your city, that's probably the one that should be the first priority for investment. So where I live in Leeds, I would say that actually, despite it being quite hilly, I think active travel should probably be the highest priority, because there are shops and services close by, and I would love to be able to ride a bike to those places. But I don't feel safe to do so because of the way the road system works. Whereas in other cities, if things are further away, maybe that's not going to work so well. And for the future of public transport, I think public transport was already under threat before the pandemic. Certainly where I am, I think Uber was having a massive impact on public transport. So if we want public transport to survive, yes, the funding model is broken, but we also need to think about how it can compete with the private car as part of a wider mobility service. So we need to be, I think, providing transport or thinking of transport and transport planning as door-to-door planning rather than maybe providing individual modes and individual services. And I think that's where I'll draw a halt to what I've got to say.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave. That was very interesting. Do you want to take over now, Mojtaba, with the questions? Or
so we're fine. So before we start the question, would ask at this stage the speakers to either their own question or as a result of the talk, if they have any questions from each other. I think that would be great to hear the thought of the two experts. Richard, Dave, if you want to specifically ask each other a question, that would be great.
I've got a question for Dave, actually, because I think what you were saying, Dave, about mobility as a service is really important. What do you think the role of the public sector or the state is in helping to enable that to happen? Or is it something that we just let technology providers do their thing and it will all appear miraculously overnight?
I think the role of the state is incredibly important. One of the things that's actually concerned me since I first heard of mobility as a service in the Nordic countries and got quite excited about it was when I've heard it transferred to other environments, it often seems to be much more of a private sector focused initiative. And, there's even a danger that organizations like Uber or Lyft could start presenting themselves as a mobility as a service operator, which doesn't seem to be within the spirit of it. I think it needs the objectives to be set by the public agencies. That doesn't mean there can't be private involvements in it. I mean, actually, I have a friend in Helsinki or a couple of friends in Helsinki who are part of one of the operators over there. And there is, I think, an important role for the private sector. I mean, they had a huge job in trying to get the different public transport operators to actually agree to operate together because they were all competing with each other. So I think there is there's a need for a business side to it, definitely, to make it work. But I also think it needs the guiding hand of the public sector, which probably means putting money in as well to make sure it meets the public objective. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. If I can ask a question in the other direction, I presume that's what I'm expected to do.
Yeah.
You put that really interesting slide up at the end, where you had these three scenarios. And one of them was sort of almost back to normal, and the other one was really, really quite different. Do you have any feel yourself from the places as to where you think on that spectrum things might go? Do you think and is the death of the commute actually only part of that first scenario, or might there be a scenario in which the commute dies but other things grow?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of observations, really. I think one thing I would say is I think not everybody can work at home. So yep. I think it's very socioeconomically driven. So it's fortunate people who tend to work in offices or universities that can work at home. So a lot of people who work in different sectors, whether it's manufacturing or hospitality or healthcare, can't work at home. So this is something that's not universal. It's certain sectors of the economy, and it tends to benefit those people on higher incomes.
Yep.
And I think if you go into cities at the moment, most of the office community is missing, but people who keep the cities moving in the background in terms of the service industries, health, hospitality, transport, logistics, they're kind of working. So it's not everyone has the freedom and flexibility and choice. And I think sometimes it's presented as something everybody can do. But also I think, you know, we've always, transport planners have for years connected travel demand with economic growth and looked at the relationship between them both. What is happening at the moment is we've got economic activity, it's not growth, but it isn't generating travel demand in the way that we've predicted for decades. So all the transport modelling capability and all the tools we've used for the last 20, 30 years can probably go in the bin now because they're all wrong.
Yeah.
Because all those relationships around income and trips are sort of based on an old world, not the new world. So I think as practitioners, you know, we need to find new ways of helping to test scenarios of the future. Alongside that, we've got access to much better data now. So we've got data from transport providers, we've got mobile phone data, you know, we've got sort of other data from other digital sources that we can use to sort of gauge activity. So the way that we start to scenario plan will be very different in the future as well, I think. And also when you think about why people travel, because travel is people are traveling for a purpose. That could be a combination, as you pointed out, that it could be for work, it could be for leisure, it could be for visiting people, kind of family reasons, whatever it is. So those drivers of demand, how much have they changed? And what kind of travel demand is that going to generate? Because, you know, it might be a very different type of travel demand. So you might have a much a larger amount of local trips in local neighborhoods, where people might have the opportunity to walk and cycle more. It might actually lead to more driving, might lead to more short trips, which would be a very difficult outcome in many cities because that would lead to congestion. So I think this drivers of demand are all changing and all moving around at the moment as well. You know, I was talking to colleagues this morning in Auckland in New Zealand. So New Zealand is probably the country that has been held up as one of the best countries in how they've responded to this pandemic. So they very quickly went into lockdown and they came fully out of lockdown, so there are no restrictions. They still don't have full utilisation of the office. So we're still at about 70 to 80% of the levels that we were at before, even though there's, you know, all the underlying conditions have now, you know, you could say they're the same as they were before.
Yes.
So we've had that change in demand because people have either found, I think one of the comments in the chat, so this, you know, the culture has changed, the office culture, concerns about presenteeism, all those things have completely disappeared. So in a country like New Zealand, that's kind of, you know, completely unrestricted, you know, 70 to 80% back in our office, if that's any indication of kind of general kind of life. So I'm not sure whether that answers the question, because it's all about it's all kind of very fluid at the moment, isn't it? And things are kind of evolving in front of us. I do think some of the bigger cities, so New York, London, cities like Paris as well, I think is going to take many, many, many months, if not years, before we get anywhere near to back where we were. Partly because the layers of demand that you have in those global cities, you've got local trips, you've got foreign trips, you've got tourists, you've got overseas visitors, overseas business visitors. A lot of that's gone because of the lack of mobility at a global level. So it's interesting to see when you strip all of that out and you're just left with a domestic market in cities like New York and London, which are huge scale of infrastructure, you can find there's a lot of space.
Yes. Yes. And I guess we start to understand how important tourism is to our economies as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And the demand generated by tourists is making, you know, a case for investment in public transport that local people benefit from.
Yes, yeah.
It all goes into the business case mix in helping to make the case. So.
Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you both. So I'm going to ask the question, but if anybody has a question, please go ahead and write your question in the chat section, and gradually will ask those questions as well. So I'm going to ask this question to both Dave and Richard. Imagine the pandemic hadn't happened. Do you think that there was an as Andrew calls it, optimal space for cities, or do cities keep really changing the mobility, the picture, the transportation, the business, everything around the city, or would there have been an optimal place that cities would just, okay, that's the ideal city, or irrelevant of, let's imagine there were no pandemic, or just that. Richard, Dave, whoever would like to.
Do you want to go first, Dave?
Yeah, I'll have a go. I mean, I'm sure cities are always changing, and for that reason, the idea of optimality probably is quite is potentially misleading, because you can't necessarily have something optimal if the conditions are constantly changing. But what I would say, and this comes as much from observing models of urban environments as well as the urban environments themselves, is that amidst all that change, there's a remarkable level of stability. So I think, for example, in transport planning and transport modeling, we tend to assume, because traffic levels, say, in cities have tended to be within certain bounds most days, that it's the same people making the same journeys for the same purposes that's causing that. And I all the things that I've seen in models and in collecting data for models, if you start to look at repeatability, it isn't anything like as much as you think it is. So I think there's cities are really complex organisms that have the ability to sort of apparently reproduce conditions of stability, when actually what's going on internally may not always be as stable as it looks, or the reasons for the stability might be different. So, for example, just going back to the tourism example, that the reason for the stability might not be the same people going to the same places, but it might be the same number of beds available in the hotels, or whatever it may be. So yeah, I mean, obviously what we've seen with the pandemic is a really big shift that's created a very new condition. And I think from a research point of view and from a professional point of view, it's fascinating, because for the first time we're getting the opportunity to observe some of these places under completely different conditions, and we're going to learn about them as a result of doing that. But because I do tend to think of urban environments as almost like organisms in some way, I think it's difficult to know how they're going to react. I mean, I'm very much with Richard that I think it's going to take years for some of these places to really recover from what we've seen.
Thank you. Richard, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I think from my experience, those cities that are prepared to adapt and change and evolve tend to be more successful. So if you look at, and I think that applies to very old cities that have been here for hundreds of years, like London, and newer cities that may not have been here for much more than 30 years. I think it's that willingness to constantly adapt and evolve. And if you try and kind of fix things based on a particular period or a particular set of priorities, then you'll probably get it wrong. And then you'll start to move out of sync with what naturally, the public, citizens, the market, technology is kind of taking you. And you just have to look at cities and how they've responded to some of the new transport services and providers like Uber. And those cities that have tried to resist it because it creates a tension with those historic, public taxi services, that's been quite difficult, and it's actually been to the detriment of the customer, because for many customers, they find Uber a fantastic offer in terms of cost, flexibility, safety, all those things. and it may be the one thing that stops them buying a car because it gives them access to on-demand transport when they need it, and therefore they don't need to buy a car, which is a good outcome. Cities that have tried to kind of manage that, over-regulate, see it as too disruptive, and we saw some of this in London in the early days, have struggled a little bit with that. So I think those countries have cities that have the right amount of regulation, that set the right framework, that are very clear on outcomes. So we want our transport to deliver, clean air, a good passenger service, inclusive, fully, set the right framework, and then allow different providers to come forward in accordance with those outcomes and principles. I think they are more successful.
Thank you. I'm sure Andrew wants to ask questions, but I asked one last question because I handed to Andrew. So in terms of the vulnerable populations, the minorities that both Richard and Dave also mentioned, is there a possibility of using this transition time to sort of create more opportunity, create equal accessibility, or whatever that is? Because we're sort of, as Dave said, we decided not to say mobility necessarily, but create opportunities for minorities, for less economically advantaged people, for disabled communities. Is there a way to use this time to sort of nudge the trajectory of transport planning and using transportation as the economic force to create opportunities for them and sort of reduce that gap? And if so, how do you think it's possible? Or do you see it happening at all? Or is there a will or any thought on this?
I think it's a really interesting point. And I'd say two things really. I think one, a general point about people's experience of the pandemic. Now I'm talking from a UK perspective, living in London, and it feels to me that there is a much greater awareness now of all members of society about different people and how they contribute to society. So this kind of this recognition, this awareness of people that work, we call them key workers in the UK, who work in healthcare, who work in transport, who do jobs that you don't necessarily see all the time, but at times of crisis, they're keeping the kind of cities and the country going. So there's much greater awareness of those kind of key roles and those key workers, and I think a recognition of the important work they're doing and how perhaps unfairly they have been treated. So I think maybe this is a sort of, people are going to come out of this process and feel it's going to be fairer. I would like to think that. And the other point I'd make is that, transport is, one of the most effective things you can do alongside other things to improve mobility. And I don't mean transport mobility, I mean mobility in society, in the economy, by connecting people to jobs, by allowing them to get access to better paid jobs, opportunities, so they're not excluded from society, they can actually participate by good, affordable, accessible public transport. Now, there's a key challenge often with price. I can see one of the comments in the chat about the cost of transport and the affordability for people working in key industries. That is a real challenge. That's been a real challenge in London because we were set the requirement by the government for the cost of the transport, those costs to be covered by fare income. Now, no other city in the world does that, which is why fares in London are so high. Now, we're in a situation now where that is not going to be the normal. We are never going to get back to that point. So government have to put a new funding model in place. So if you sort of take that, issue and take a society that is now much more supportive and aware and wants to support their kind of fellow citizens working in key industries like healthcare, then, we could use that as an opportunity to encourage more affordable and cheaper public transport, a new funding model.
Thank you. Very good. Dave, do you have any thought on that, or?
There I am. Right, I can unmute myself there. Yeah, I think, I would actually, I think Richard made a really good point before about how the working from home situation is actually benefiting the wealthier people in society. And so I share his his feelings about how there is an opportunity there to try and address inequalities. But I also think this is a situation which has the danger of building inequalities in as well. You know, there's been plenty of work out there just for the UK suggesting that the north of England is going to take longer to recover than the southeast. And I think at all levels, it's probably, you know, it's going to be the younger people in less well-paid temporary jobs who are probably going to suffer losing their jobs most. So at a lot of levels, I think there's going to be a lot of challenges. And I don't think we've, you know, at the moment, we're still dealing with the health fallout. We've not even come to see what the economic and political fallout of this is going to be. I hope and I suspect we're going to be pushed towards more inclusive politics because it's going to be the only way to survive. But there's going to be a lot of challenges because we're going to need more money for services, and yet there's going to be less money in the society. So there's going to be some very, very big choices to be made and big decisions to be made, I think.
Thank you both. Andrew, please take over.
Thanks, Mustafa. So one question that I put in the chat, but I realized I'd sent it just privately, is perhaps does the COVID-19 crisis kind of highlight a potential existential threat to the city as an organizational structure, really? You know, but what COVID-19 has shown is a decoupling between mobility and access to opportunity. Certainly, Richard made the point that it isn't universal, but for the types of jobs which generate wealth in cities, such as, for example, in London, if we use the London example, the City of London, a lot of the wealth generating jobs which are available in the City of London can probably be done just as well remotely. So does this almost present a challenge to the city in terms of making them less attractive as a place to go to than previously?
I think that's a real risk, Andrew. Absolutely, because you'll be familiar, and some of the colleagues on the call may be familiar with the term agglomeration, which is a phrase that's been used to describe the economic power of cities, where people in highly productive jobs want to be near other people in highly productive jobs, and there is some sort of supercharged economic benefit that comes from their proximity to each other because things kind of spark off each other. And that's been the theory for many years, and that's supported the case for growing the number of jobs, for example, in central London. And then it's also made the case for investing in transport to support that larger number of jobs. So that's something we've relied on very heavily for the last 10, 15 years. Now, if you can achieve the same economic results with less people in the centre, and your cost of moving them and the environmental cost of getting them there is less, but you've got the same economic benefit, then that is, what's wrong with that as an outcome? Well, I guess it has a number of consequences. One is some of the use that you've created in cities like London needs to change. You've got too many buildings of too high a value. What do you do with them? You've got, hundreds of thousands of people who work in central London, whether they're in retail, restaurants, hospitality, transport, cleaning, all those kind of jobs that support that daytime population. You don't need all of those jobs. That's a problem. So there is a sort of, a series of quite significant consequences that need to be thought about that have their own economic cost. So I don't think it's not a win-win situation at all. And just from a transport perspective, one of the outcomes you have from that dense, centralised employment pool is it's really public transport friendly. It's really easy to move large numbers of people by public transport if you have the capacity. A more dispersed model with people working across the city and having more local trips is more likely to lead to a more car-based city with lots of car trips for smaller trips, I would say, and that has some economic and environmental consequences as a result. So I would say it's not straightforward, but I think the world that you've presented, Andrew, is potentially one of the scenarios that we're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. do I think the attractiveness of cities will decrease in the long term? My intuition is probably not. But just as, you know, I think Andrew's presentation, he had a drop in city populations after World War II. I know in the 1960s there was quite a lot of policy associated with London trying to de-densify London. So, you know, the Humber Bridge was built because supposedly there would be an East Coast motorway and people would move from London to Hull to live. That never happened, and, you know, actually I do a lecture on why that never happened. And my thinking is, yes, I can see how this may be the sort of almost obsession with moving to the city that we've had in the last couple of decades might well go away for a while, but I still think cities are probably going to be very attractive places. For established business practices that you can do remotely because everybody knows each other and knows what they're doing, I think that's fine. But I guess cities are still the sort of melting pots where culture happens and where they're attractive from a tourism point of view. And just going back to my sort of my little starting point where I talked about new generation coming through and the idea of a sort of almost a global generation, I suspect those people are still going to be attracted to the cities and the major hubs, as it were. Not all hubs are cities, but I can see we're not necessarily going to move away from that in the long term. I think they're still going to be attractive places, but maybe they will be less prone to the sort of obsession with living in that place over all the time, for example.
And the one thing we're not talking about so much is climate change and global warming, and the whole question of what is the best land use pattern to deliver the least climate impact going forward. So maybe cities have this really unique role going forward, that they, you know, again, those cities that are prepared to adapt and think about new technologies, think about net zero carbon, and think about that transition and what that means in terms of transport, building types, investment. Maybe those cities are going to be the places that people want to be, and maybe that's the most sustainable land use pattern. And we need to be encouraging, you know, a certain type of city because that delivers against those net zero commitments more effectively than anything else of a more dispersed model, which probably doesn't. So I think there's a sort of there's an immediacy around COVID and economic kind of recovery and all those things, but I think we have to somehow try and connect what's happening now and use that as a platform to sort of almost build back better in a net zero context, so you can sort of try and solve all these problems in one go. It sounds easy, but that's got to be the plan, hasn't it? Yeah, it's got to be the plan, and I think the point is there's a difference between, at the moment we've got push factors that don't want people to be people don't want to be together because they're concerned about the virus implications, but actually probably what we need to be thinking about is more the pull factors of, you know, now that I can work at home, if assuming that's the job I've got, why should I be wasting an hour each way every day traveling into the city? I think that's probably the bigger issue going forward. I'm sure we will get to a point where it is perfectly safe for people to travel together on public transport again, for example.
Yeah, and I think that unfortunately we've got to the end of our time window, but I think we've had a really interesting discussion again today. What's becoming apparent about these roundtables is that at the start you don't really know how it's going to go, and we've had three really interesting discussions, and it's in no small part to the input provided by Richard and Dave. So thank you very much again to Richard and Dave for your inputs today.